Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture podcast where we talk about everything dog. Q&As with veterinarian professionals, rescue operators, everyday topics. We cover everything dog on this podcast. So make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture podcast on your favorite podcast platform and make sure you're following us on social media on both Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for listening. Now here's that next episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture podcast. This is your host, Brittany, and we are joined today by Lexie. She is with Keto Natural Pet Foods, and we're going to be talking about the animal welfare crisis. So thank you for joining us, Lexie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Animal welfare is beyond a passion of mine. So it's a topic that I love talking about.
So let's talk a little bit about your background. You've got a lot of really interesting dog-related stuff in your background. So fill the listeners in a little bit on like what you've done, what you're doing, and kind of how everything came to fruition.
Yeah, so my fiance and I now joke that I'm just strictly a dog professional because I've touched so many different parts of everywhere from private training to animal welfare nonprofits. I was a vet tech for a minute and found out that that wasn't necessarily my true passion. That behavior is definitely where my heart lies. But I was in private training to start right after college and was kind of in the height of all of the pack walking days. So I don't know if you've ever seen photos of the people who walk around with like 10, 15, 20 dogs. So that's how I kind of got started in the animal world and learned how to become a really good handler as a result of handling all those dogs and walking in a pack. And then from there, my career transitioned into wanting to become a little bit more knowledgeable in the science of training. And so I left my private training position and then actually took a position with a nonprofit called Dogs Playing for Life. And their main programming is bringing enrichment programming to shelters across the United States. So they do play groups, which if you think of like a big controlled dog park for shelter dogs, that's what I was teaching all of these different shelters. So definitely probably the most passionate job that I've held in my career so far. And then it's like I said, where my heart lies. And as you mentioned, now I've come back into the private training world and work for a dog food company. So I have the nutrition, the vet experience, and then also the training and behavior.
It's important to be well-rounded. Like I'm even finding in the podcast, the more and more I learn and the more people I talk to, the more gaps I see in myself, like little things that either I haven't thought about or just don't know. And so like even this has kind of been a journey for me, but it's been really interesting and it's only beneficial, to any of the dogs that I help, whether it's my rescues, whether it's the dogs I work with at the shelters, rescues that I can help in town. It's all really beneficial knowledge.
Yeah, and I think just the resources that you build when you know that many people too is extremely important. There are really no new ideas especially in the training world. But I think, just hearing where everyone pulls information from, especially when we're dealing with something like the animal welfare and sheltering crisis that we're currently in, it's so important to have individuals that come with such different backgrounds and can really, we have to pool all of our resources together. And that's how we're gonna solve it.
Right. So the animal welfare crisis, that's the heart of today's conversation. We could probably spend 2 weeks talking about it and it wouldn't be adequate.
I know.
So the first thing to even get out there is to let people know or help people understand that there is a crisis and that this is, I don't want to say the worst time for animal welfare, but at the same time, I'm not so sure we've ever seen shelters as full as they are, rescues at max capacity as high as they are. And so, some of the things that you and I talked about even off air was how can the public help? What can the public do? Because I think a lot of people are like, well, I can't adopt. I have enough dogs, or I'm too busy. I don't want to adopt. And so I think the first key piece to this is kind of discussing why we have the crisis, and then B, kind of talking about what the public can do. So, do you want to touch on kind of like the crisis that we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, to put it in perspective, we're currently euthanizing puppies. And euthanasia is something that when you have 8 dogs to every single litter, there's no way that we're going to be able to place all, it's kind of been inevitable that this is something that is going to catch up to us. And it
Hmm.
currently has for a number of reasons. You have the aftermath of COVID. You have just the sheer amount of dogs that we have when it comes to litters and on the streets. A lot of dogs come in as strays. And so what you're seeing are shelters that are at either critical capacity or that have been over capacity for years and are
Hmm.
just at a breaking point where we have to be able to find alternative solutions. And obviously, we have too many dogs coming in and we don't have enough dogs going out. And so we're really putting a lot of pressure on our shelter system, and it's only a matter of time before it breaks. And so
Right.
today I am excited to talk about, yeah, what can we do not only as a general public but professionals to, and why are not enough dogs leaving, and why
Hmm.
do we still have, like, my friends and family specifically, I lose sleep at night over this question because it's why are my friends and family buying from breeders when they have somebody who is in their ear constantly saying, hey, this crisis is real, it's here, the shelters need our help, and why are we not doing anything about it? So
Right.
it's very interesting. I kind of pooled a bunch of different people to get their responses, and the feedback has been pretty insightful.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so from my perspective, half the people I talk to are not quote unquote dog people. They don't live in this world. They don't live in our like doggy world. And so it was news to them that there's a problem. They're like, what do you mean there's a problem? Well, why? Well, why don't they just adopt the dogs? And it's like, well, that sounds so perfect. That's what they want to do, but it's not that simple. And then you have those exact same people who are faulting the kill shelters, and I don't know if we'll get into this today, but kill shelters are not inherently bad. I think it is inevitable, and I think if we keep going at the rate that we're at, many of the non-kill shelters are going to have to be kill shelters because at some point in time those dogs are taking up space. They're deteriorating in their kennels. Once they've been there, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years at some places. It's like, what's their quality of life? And should we allow them to continue to take up this space when they're not going to be adopted? They're going to be here forever. And there's other dogs that need to come in. So, the people that I've spoken to, it's a little scary that people don't quite understand the severity of what's going on. So, kind of
Absolutely.
kind of on your point of the breeders, so, like, buying from a breeder, and we can kinda just start with this. There's always going to be breeders. Now, there's good breeders, there's bad breeders. You've got your backyard breeders, you got people doing it for money who don't know what they're doing. I think we see a lot of those dogs coming into the shelter. They went home to a family and they were sick, they had parvo, they had some kind of defect, some kind of issue. So we're kind of seeing the repercussions of these backyard breeders. And along with that, I think a lot of people think, well, I can't go to the shelter to get my little, let's just say pug. To get my little pug, I need to go to the breeder, where that's not true. The shelters have every single breed.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and
I'd,
I
I'd love
think
to hear like,
oh,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, exactly the points I was going to hit on. I've kind of tried to grapple with this in my head a lot and find out, like, okay, really truly, what are the motivators for people? Because if we can start to solve for some of them or just educate so people understand that the world we live in nowadays, there is access to breed specific rescues.
Hmm.
There's access to things that just weren't there in animal welfare 5 years or even, obviously 10 years ago, but even just 5 years ago. It's
Right.
incredible how much animal welfare, how far it's come in just a short amount of time. And that's really, I think, the missing piece that people don't necessarily understand is that, okay, so if I'm looking at getting a dog, I I think that there's a couple of reasons, and from the feedback that I received, these were kind of like the main responses that I got, which was I want to be able to predict my dog's temperament. So
Mhm.
if I buy a dog from a breeder, then I'm better able to predict what kind of temperament I'm going to get. The second, and I think the one that's going to be extremely difficult to change, is there's a certain status that comes with purchasing a dog from a breeder. You know,
Right.
people really identify, um, depending on if you have adopted a dog or if you've purchased a dog, what dog did you purchase? My fiance, for example, is a big fan of St. Bernards. He loves
Mhm.
St. Bernards. His dog has come from a breeder. When he takes his dog to the dog park, everyone turns their head and they're like, oh my gosh, your dog is beautiful. Wow, your dog is huge. That's the biggest dog I've ever seen. And
Mhm.
with it comes a little bit, and he'll openly admit this as well, but with it comes a little bit of status and a boost of his ego to a degree.
Right.
And so that is something that I do think people look for when they're purchasing a dog. And the other responses I got were some things like the opportunity just kind of fell into my lap, and then a couple of other of just like random, less prominent, other than I want to be able to predict my temperament, and I like the way that people look at me with this dog. So I
Mhm.
think like a lot of it falls into that category. But I also think the most important thing that people don't necessarily realize is that in shelters nowadays, we have things like off leash playgroups that are able to give you such an incredible picture of the temperament that you're looking
Mhm.
for when you say, I want to be able to filter and make sure that I'm getting the right temperament that I want in my next dog. So, something
Right.
to think about and to talk a little bit more about is like, we should be identifying, okay, what's the reason that I want to purchase a dog, or why my family members want to purchase a dog. And if that's the case, are there any resources that we can give them or that we know of ourselves? So that way we can say, hey, have you reached out to your shelter to ask if they're doing playgroups? Because if they are, I bet you they'll be able to tell you XYZ about the dog.
Mhm.
Or, hey, have you reached out to see if they have any puppies? Because age is typically also comes
Right.
along with the territory if I want to be able to predict my dog's temperament. Like, have you
Mhm.
reached out to see? They have, a lot of litters of puppies that are coming in right now. So I think these different things that, one, identifying that there's a crisis, but then two, understanding just the amount of resources that shelters have and now use is
Mhm.
is new. People, yeah, it's when was the last time that you walked into a shelter, and have you seen some of these programs that they're implementing? It's pretty incredible.
Right. And along with the resource component, I think now we do a pretty good job of offering, low cost spay and neuter or low cost vaccines. I know here in Jacksonville, there's some different places that do it. Like they'll post up at Walgreens once a month, or I think we have one like specific clinic, no more homeless pets, something to that extent. But they do very, very inexpensive vet care. And so I think maybe that's also sort of like a resource to think about. People are like, well, yes, I have this dog. Yes, she runs around the streets. However, I cannot afford to get her fixed. I know she's had 20 puppies. Oh, well. And it's like, well, no, you do have to take responsibility and accountability here and think about those things. So, getting your dog spayed or neutered, if you do own a dog.
Yeah, and some of the other ways that professionals can help out with the animal welfare crisis are if you have any sort of skill set in the veterinary field, those spay and neuter clinics are always looking for volunteers. And depending on your state, it's different in some states than it is others. But that's one way that you can give back. Obviously, education. All shelters will accept any form of help when it comes to trainers coming in. They typically have dogs that they're looking to get into foster that they need feedback on. this dog is really shut down in the shelter environment, but is there someone out there who has a little bit more knowledge that can help us and see what this dog is like in a home environment? So if you're a professional with any of those skill sets, that's also a way that you can give back as well. And trust me, there's just with working with, I mean, I think I introduced playgroups to over 50 shelters in the United States. So part
Mhm.
of the cool dynamic of working with Dogs Playing for Life is you just got to see all of these different environments and kind of take things that worked well in each environment and see if you could help other shelters. And it's always the case that shelters are looking for help. It's the one place that you can walk in with any background, whether you're a trainer that specializes in balance training, positive reinforcement training, whatever your
Mhm.
background is, they want it and they'll take it. And so, yes, anything that you can do as a professional to give back is obviously very helpful.
And let's talk about the general public a little bit. Obviously, adopting, but that's not realistic or practical, nor do we want everyone to adopt because some people who may adopt are the same people who's taking them right back to the shelter. So, you mentioned fostering, of course. And if you can foster even temporarily, I know, like, especially in Jacksonville, Florida, we have a lot of different programs where you can do it for like the holidays. Like, I know they did like something for Thanksgiving, a little sleepover. So, that's kind of one thing that I can think of. Another one that I don't think a lot of people consider is the power of social media. So, following your local
Yes.
shelter or your rescues and share those dogs. Like, just the simple fact that you click that share button, you don't know who that's going to reach, and it might find that dog a home. It's free, it's totally free. It takes you half a second when you're scrolling.
Have you heard of the Seen Equals Saved initiative out of California? It touches
No.
exactly on that, which is, yeah, it's, obviously the more a dog or cat is seen, shared, like, posted, even just the comments to give it a boost, then obviously the better chance they have of getting out of the shelter alive. So, yeah, Seen Equals Saved. And one of the things that I have implemented at Keto Natural is instead of doing a loyalty program where you can buy bags of dog food and after, your 10th purchase gets you a free bag, we do incentives for volunteering. So if you reach an X amount of volunteer hours, then there's a percentage off your purchase. And we do that as a way for us to really get people in the door. And one of the
Mhm.
things that you can do in order to earn volunteer points is just sharing a post, because social media is so powerful. And it's a way to get some of these puppies that are currently in the shelter out into a home, because of course the shelter environment is so stressful for them to even stay in for a matter of weeks. So
Mhm.
yes, share. If you can't adopt, if you can't donate, whether that be your time or money, just sharing alone makes a bigger difference than I think anybody even realizes.
Yeah, that's how I found 3 of my rescues was Facebook.
Oh my gosh.
I Yeah,
Wow.
I know, I saw them being shared. My phone should be taken away now that I have 4 dogs, like, I should cancel all social media, but nevertheless, that's how I saw them, and I kind of would lay low and, like, watch them get shared, and seeing the longevity that they were sitting at the rescues, I was like, "Okay, it's my turn, like, I have to go do something." Um, and so, again, not for everyone, but just the simple fact that so many people shared it and I just kept seeing it. And it was content that I wanted because I do fall into that breed specific kind of person. I have 4 Pomeranians. I've always had Pomeranians. And it's even crazy to think like people are like, oh, that little designer dog, like they never get dumped, they never get surrendered. And it's like, no, quite the opposite. They're getting dumped and surrendered every single day, whether it's for their barking, whether it's for inability to potty train them once they get older, some of their different health issues between their teeth and their knees. And so, I mean, every breed is subject to being surrendered or, just rehomed, if you will, which is a whole other topic we could talk about, but we won't get into rehoming.
Right.
Um, and you mentioned volunteering, and I don't think people understand that as well. Like you can just take an afternoon, whether you're cleaning, whether you're walking the dogs, like that little bit of time, even if it's just a couple hours, makes a huge impact for the shelter, the staff of the shelter, and also those dogs. They're seeing people, they're becoming more socialized. And you're even able, like you said earlier, to kind of report back on their temperament. Like, oh, I took little Joey on a walk. He didn't seem like the cats that we passed. That kind of thing. What are some other, can
Yes.
you think of like other ideas for like the general public, just other ways that they can kind of help mitigate what we're seeing?
Yeah, oh my gosh, the list is endless, to be honest with you. And the reason, like, especially just to kind of touch on, I guess, why, why should you care if you're not a dog person, if you're not a cat person, right? Why should I care about this crisis that is happening in the animal welfare sheltering world currently? And I
Mhm.
think the reality is that some of your taxpayer dollars are going to help this issue. And when you keep a dog in a kennel for 6, 12, 14, however long months, you're paying to keep that dog there, and you have to make sure that the shelter is staffed, and you have to provide adequate resources. A lot of help and support comes from donations. So that's one way that you can give back if you're not interested in actually physically going to volunteer. But outside of donation, whether that's resources or money, you can also do things online as well. So if you're like, man, I really want to help, but I just can't devote the time to drive into the shelter. A lot of shelters need administration help. So whether that's
Mhm.
looking through applications or filtering through photos, things like that, any rescue or organization will gladly accept that help. If you want to go in and volunteer in person, typically there's some sort of orientation that's involved, and that's just for your safety. Um, but once you get beyond that, it's an hour-ish usually, then you're kind of clear and free to walk dogs. Some shelters do playgroups where volunteers can actually go and participate in running playgroups, which is the most incredible thing, because you get to watch the dogs play with one another, and you bring them back to their kennels and they're satiated and they're happy, and you feel
Mhm.
really good about uh, you know, reaching a larger group of dogs than you would if you just walk one individual dog. So that's one way that you can get involved. And then even just doing things like enrichment, making Kongs, making frisbees with peanut butter on the back and hanging those outside the dog's kennel. These are all ways
Mhm.
to kind of get involved. Some shelters have programs where the kids come in and they read to the dogs
Mhm.
and cats. And so that's a way for kids to get involved without actually touching or interacting with the animals. So if you go to dogsplayingforlife.org, there's a list of resources that you can find on enrichment that you can do for the dogs that are currently in the shelter. ASPCA also has an incredible enrichment resource as well online. So those are the two places that you can find where, if you find yourself asking, what can I do that maybe doesn't actually involve me going and touching any animals or cleaning or
Mhm.
doing anything like that, then there's still plenty of opportunities for you to enrich and make the lives of the animals that are currently in the shelter better.
Yeah. And you mentioned the enrichment idea. There are a few shelters sort of near us. They accept toilet paper rolls or paper towel rolls,
Yes.
and they kind of like put the treats in them and roll them up. Like even just saving your toilet paper rolls, like that's so simple. And once you have a big bag of them, you could take them there and drop them off. Um, anytime you have any old blankets or towels, if you think you're going to throw them away, take them to the shelter. They can use them. Your dog got some treats, your dog didn't like the treats. Depending on the shelter, you might be able to go kind of like drop those off, just kind of help them out with that, because so many shelters are, well, I would venture to say all shelters are underfunded to a certain extent.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like I said, I don't know of anything that a shelter has turned away when I've gone to donate it. They have
Yeah.
always been like, yeah, we could find use for this, I'm sure. So,
Mhm.
yes, even things that you are not sure of, bring it in and see if you can get some. I mean, a lot of them, a lot of shelters also have some sort of thrift store where they end up selling items through a thrift shop. So, that's something to look out for too. But I think the biggest thing is we're currently in a crisis. It's super important for the public to understand that the shelters are overrun and we just have far too many dogs. And any way that you can help, any way that you can get your foot in the door is going to be super beneficial, because I do genuinely believe that as we continue to progress in animal welfare, we're only going to get better and better, meaning that
Mm-hmm.
the dogs that end up at the shelters that do end up getting euthanized, they've been thoroughly assessed for behavior, or maybe it's a medical euthanasia. And we keep getting better at that component of it, and really
Mm-hmm.
working hard to save the dogs that deserve and need to be saved. And yet here we are, we're still in the phase where there are dogs that have been tested with dogs and other people, and they're extremely social and are
Mm-hmm.
currently being euthanized because we just don't have enough space. So
Mm-hmm. And let's briefly I want to touch on the flip side of things. So this is another topic we could talk for 7 days on, but how shelters not necessarily even use their funding, but barriers to adoption. And this could really be shelters, this could be rescues, but maybe talking about what are those adoption barriers and how can we remove those? And obviously, we can't just here's a free dog, here's a free dog. We can't do that. We know that that doesn't necessarily work. But if you could just kind of touch on what are some of those barriers and what could people maybe do to break those down to help the public, not have to jump through 20 hoops to get the dogs.
yeah, absolutely. I think the more accessible and easy you can make it for the public, the more adoptions you're going to have. And sometimes breaking down some of those barriers involves things like, okay, if we can't reduce our cost, then do we require an application? And on that application, does it require something like a fenced in yard? And do we
Hmm.
decline people who are looking to adopt a dog because they don't have a fenced in yard? Or do we take the time to really fully understand their experience and recognize that they might work from home and be able to let their dogs out on leash 10 times a day? So, does a fenced
Hmm.
yard really matter for this dog? So, I think looking at some of those things when it comes to adoption, one other way that the public can get involved is that when a rescue goes to pull dogs from a shelter, let's say they're looking to pull a mom and her 8 puppies, there's a fee that goes along with that. And so if you can donate anything, if you want to sponsor a rescue pull, that's something that you can look at doing as well. So that removes a barrier for the rescues to then come in and support the dogs that are in the shelter. That's one way to help. I think some other adoption barriers too are honestly just not knowing the dogs well enough. And
Hmm.
this comes from sometimes a lack of resource. Sometimes it comes from the fact that we're deeply rooted in fear for a dog biting a person or a dog biting another dog. I know that there have been shelters that I've worked with who have been a little hesitant to introduce something like playgroups in the past for this reason. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, it comes from a place where people have been punished for dogs getting in dog fights, and it's no
Right.
fault of their own. It's just how the system has functioned for all of this time. So some of these barriers where it's just, we're not really sure. We think this dog is social, but we haven't tested them with other dogs yet. Or maybe we've only done a walk on leash and this is what we thought we saw. Those are some things too that I think the more that we advance, some of these things will start to be stripped away. So we can
Hmm.
really let the dogs make their own choices. And by letting
Right.
them, this is why I really advise people, when you're looking for a dog and you have your list, you've identified your list, these are the things that I want in this dog, my next dog. And you bring that to the shelter and they go, oh, well, we can answer 8 out of your 10 questions because we've put a dog in a yard with handlers, with other dogs. We've let them make their own choices. And here's everything that we've seen. I think
Hmm.
temperament testing is another barrier too. That's something that I we really never did at my canine center, just because it was when I was directing the behavior and training program there. It just really didn't give us too much information. Typically what that
Hmm.
means, the temperament testing is you bring a dog into a room, you run them through a series of tests. So that's everything from handling to, does the dog show anything like food guarding? If we put a food bowl down and then try to take the food bowl away from them. And what it's been shown is that some of these behaviors that you see in a shelter environment, don't translate over to a home environment. Right. So are these temperament tests actually giving us the proper information that we can then take to the general public? So that could be another barrier to adoption as well.
Yeah. Well, I know like I said, we could talk on this for days, weeks, months. We could shout it from the rooftops. But hopefully this is helpful for any of the listeners, and we appreciate your time.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you for everything. I know that you're big into the rescue world as well. So thank you for everything that you do. And yeah, thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Canine Culture Podcast. Please make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you're following us on social media. If you have any recommendations, any topics that you'd like to hear, if you know of any guests that would be good for the show, or if you yourself want to be a guest, please reach out to us. Send us an email at canineculturepodcast@gmail.com, or send us a direct message on social media. Thank you for listening, and please share this with any of your dog-loving friends.